Welcome to the Football Debates Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. In this episode, we're going to break down two standard offensive formations and the defensive formations and personnel to counter them. These are common formations or personnel groups for both the offense and the defense. You'll see them at any point in the game in any situation. Could be 1st and 10, could be 3rd and long, could be 2nd and short, whatever it might be. But before we get into that, we are going to talk about something that you, as a new fan, may hear every week the announcers talk about, but don't necessarily understand. And that is the line of scrimmage. The line of scrimmage is an imaginary line that stretches from sideline to sideline. It is the length of the football and can be at whatever yard line the ball is at. It's also referred to as the neutral zone. Prior to the start of the play, no defensive player can cross into that neutral zone, and no offensive player can line up in that same neutral zone also. But the offense does have some certain rules that they have to follow. First of all, they have to have 7 men lined up on the line of scrimmage. And by being on the line of scrimmage, that is within 1 yard of the football. Or for the offensive linemen, their head has to break an invisible plane in line with the hips of the center. No defensive personnel can line up in that area. The defense can have as many or as few players on the line of scrimmage as they would like, but the offense does have to have 7. The only person who really can be lined up in the neutral zone area is the center. He's only supposed to have his hand on the football. His head isn't supposed to be over the football, but with the size of today's players, that is allowed to some extent. As long as the head of the center doesn't go past the front end of the football, in a sense, onto the defensive side of the line of scrimmage, he is generally fine. But to look at these positions, we need to understand a little bit about the players that are in these positions and what the importance they have and what some of the teams are looking for in these players. We're going to begin with the center. This is a player that starts every play. Oftentimes, teams like the center to be the most intelligent player on the offensive line. They oftentimes call out the offensive line signals or make adjustments. Oftentimes, you'll see a center pointing this direction or pointing that direction. What they're doing is identifying potential threats from the defense, either a blitzing linebacker or a blitzing defensive back, to make everyone aware of that potential rusher. The center will sometimes, depending on the offensive scheme or what the coaches want, will make adjustments to the blocking assignments. Sometimes the quarterbacks will do it. It just depends on the type of offensive system that you have. Most centers need to be very mobile, but also strong enough to handle the 320-plus pound defensive linemen that are oftentimes lined up directly in front of them. Next to the center are the 2 guards, right guard and left guard. Generally, the guards are roughly around 6'3", 320 pounds, maybe more. These are usually the least athletic players on the football field, offense or defense. These are players, not that they're not athletes, but they still have to have athletic ability, but compared to the other players on the field, they are the least athletic ones generally on the field. Since most teams are right-handed, going back to the history of football, generally the right guard is considered more physical, oftentimes the more powerful of the 2 guards in the formation, and they also have to have, in a sense, more strength and power to deal with the defensive lineman on their own, as opposed to the left guard. Left guards can be a little bit smaller. We're talking maybe an inch, 5 or 10 pounds, nothing significant. Oftentimes the left guards are seen as a little bit more agile because they are lined up next to the center, and oftentimes there's a defensive lineman lined up in the space or the gap between the center and the guard. So the center and the left guard can block that defensive lineman together, whereas the right guard is generally on their own. Outside of the guards, you have the offensive tackles, right tackle and left tackle. These players are generally taller than the guards, and while they may be the same weight or maybe even weigh a little bit less than the guards, they are, in a sense, more trim. They look more svelte. They're not as broad or as stocky as the guards are. Because these offensive tackles, they're on the end of the line of scrimmage. Oftentimes they are blocking a smaller, quicker player, such as a defensive end or an outside linebacker or an edge rusher. So these players need to be more athletic than the guards. They need to be able to back up quickly in pass protection and also get down the field to get to a linebacker or a safety who may be coming up to stop a run play. These players sometimes are referred to as dancing bears, but the offensive tackles generally are very athletic. And in today's NFL, the left tackle is often one of the highest paid and one of the key players on an offensive unit because they are pass protecting the blind side or the back side of the quarterback. These are 5 of the 7 players that an offense needs to have on the line of scrimmage before the start of every play. The next player is usually a tight end. Really creative name. It's just because that player is tight to the rest of the linemen and he is at the end of the line. Tight ends are often referred to as a Y player to designate them from the other receivers. Today's NFL tight ends are generally around 6'4", 245 to 255 pounds. But they have to be a combination of an offensive lineman and a receiver. They have to be able to block. Sometimes they'll help block the defensive tackles or the defensive ends on their own. But they also have to have enough speed and agility to run pass routes and get open against linebackers and defensive backs. With the tight end being the Y and on one end of the line of scrimmage, on the opposite end of the line of scrimmage is what is known as the split end because that receiver is split from the rest of the line. This is often referred to as the X receiver. And since this receiver is out and away from the rest of the formation, oftentimes offense have the X player as their best wide receiver. Hopefully that will force the defense to cover him with more than just the cornerback. Maybe a safety will help or another defensive player will help cover him. By drawing that attention to that receiver, maybe the offense can get an advantage somewhere else. So the center, the 2 guards, the 2 tackles, the tight end, and the split end, those are the 7 offensive players on the line of scrimmage. The rest of the offensive players need to be more than a yard off the line of scrimmage. For our purposes here, we're looking at a spread offense. So we have a receiver outside of the tight end, often referred to as the Z receiver. This receiver is, depending on the offensive system, usually a little bit smaller, not quite as fast. And when we're talking not quite as fast at the NFL level, we are talking a tenth of a second, maybe a few hundredths of a second slower than the X receiver. This receiver oftentimes is referred to as a possession receiver, where he isn't necessarily expected to draw double coverage like the X receiver is. But this player is oftentimes designed to run routes to catch the ball, secure it, and maybe get some yardage after the catch, not so much as a threat to go on a deeper route to pull the defense away. But still, this player must be a good hands-catching receiver. Behind the center, obviously, you have the quarterback, the field general of the offense, the one who directs the plays. And we'll get into a little bit more of what the quarterback does on a typical play here in another episode. But the quarterback is the field general, in a sense, a coach on the field. And depending on the type of offensive system, some teams have the quarterback as more like a statue in a sense, somebody who's fixed in the pocket in a general area. Some teams like a quarterback that is more mobile, that can get out and run. And some teams like a quarterback that's a little bit more of a balance between the two. They have the mobility to get out in space, but they are more of a passer than a runner. Behind the quarterback, you have the running back. This is a player that carries the ball for yards, runs with the ball the most. Some teams run what's called a platoon system, where they have 2 backs that pretty much share the load. Other teams focus on one running back who may run the ball 20, 25, 30 times in a game. And then they have another back that will just run the ball a few times in the game to give their primary back or their lead back a break. Running backs at the NFL level need to be good receivers out of the backfield. And one thing that is a key and becoming even more of an important aspect of an NFL running back is being able to see a defensive player that's coming on a blitz, and be able to block them to protect the quarterback. The last member of this offensive set is the slot receiver. This receiver is lined up between the left tackle and the X receiver in our system here. This player is usually a smaller, quicker receiver, and usually by small, we're talking even small by NFL standards. Oftentimes these players are 5'9", 5'10", anywhere from 175 to 190 pounds. These players don't generally run deep. Their job is to run quick routes, have the agility to shake free from a defensive player and get open on their own. Oftentimes these receivers will take punishment when they run over the middle because they are so small, but they often have the best hands on the team, and with their quickness, they are able to get open in short, small areas. So that is just the basic spread offense formation of a typical NFL or college team. The defense to counter that, for our purposes, we're going to go very basic with what is called a 4-2, 4 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. We're going to start with the 2 defensive tackles. The defensive tackle that is lined up closest to the center, or in the gap between the center and one of the guards, is the nose tackle. This is generally the largest of the defensive linemen, and their job primarily is to plug up the running lanes in the middle to stop the run. These players are often 320 pounds plus, and the more blockers they can occupy, the more it frees the other defensive players to get through unblocked and make a play. The other defensive tackle is simply referred to as a defensive tackle. Oftentimes they are lined up on the outside shoulder of one of the guards, usually on the opposite side of the nose tackle. And this player is a little bit smaller than the nose tackle, but a little bit quicker, and they are considered more of a pass rusher, where they're trying to get up the field to get after the quarterback on a pass play. But on a run, they are still expected to do a similar job to the nose tackle, where they plug up the running lanes and occupy as many blockers as possible. On the ends of the defensive side of the line of scrimmage are either defensive ends. More commonly, they're referred to as edge rushers. Depending on the defensive scheme, sometimes these are outside linebacker type of players, but for our purposes here, we're just going to refer to them as the defensive ends. Their job is primarily to rush the passer on pass plays. Now, on run plays, you'll often hear announcers referring to a defensive player as setting the edge. And what that means is for these defensive ends to set a firm break point where the running back either has to break outside towards the sideline, where hopefully their other defensive players are coming up for support to force the running back out of bounds, but more likely it's to force that running back into the middle of the defense where all of the help is. Defensive ends, depending on the type of scheme, can be anywhere from about 6'3", 6'4", 250 pounds to 6'7", 285, 290 pounds. It just depends on the ability of the player and the type of defense that that particular team runs. Behind the defensive line, in the spread defense, we have 2 linebackers. We're just going to refer to them as linebackers. We're not going to give them any names right now. These players oftentimes will have a running back or a tight end in man-to-man coverage, depending on what the defense is doing on that particular play. These players can sometimes rush a quarterback on a blitz. And on a run play, they're designed to come up, fill any gaps that may open for the running back to run through, avoid the offensive lineman trying to block them, and get up and make the tackle. On the outside edges of the defense, you have the cornerbacks. For our purposes here in this diagram, they are on the X and the Z receiver. The cornerbacks either will cover the receivers man-to-man, or depending on the type of defensive scheme or coverage called, they will have a particular zone, sometimes short, sometimes deep, just depending on what the defense is trying to do to fool the offense. Some cornerbacks are better at man coverage, some are better at zone, some are better at what is called press coverage when they're right up against the line of scrimmage. So as soon as the ball is hiked or snapped, they can get their hands on the receiver to try to disrupt the timing of a pass route, or to try to keep them from getting open as quickly as a quarterback needs them to. Behind the corners, you have the safeties, a free safety and a strong safety. The strong safety is oftentimes the more physical of the two, mostly because they line up on the same side as the tight end. Sometimes a strong safety will have a tight end in man-to-man coverage. Sometimes they will be in a deep zone. It just depends on, again, what type of coverage is being called. The other safety is listed as the free safety. This safety oftentimes will cover a deep middle area. Some teams like to have one safety all the way in the back. This is a player that really needs to be a very good tackler. They are the last line of defense, and hopefully they can make a tackle so a running back or receiver doesn't go for a touchdown. The last defensive position in this spread set is the nickel cornerback, because he is the fifth defensive back. This player is often a smaller defensive back opposite the slot receiver, generally about the same size and same abilities. The biggest difference between a slot receiver and a slot corner is slot receivers have better hands for catching the football. But a slot corner oftentimes can anticipate and recover quickly if the slot receiver makes a move or a juke to try and get open. That slot corner hopefully can recover and stay with that receiver to maintain their coverage. Some slot corners, to increase their value, have become very good at blitzing. They might line up like they're covering that slot receiver man-to-man, and then they blitz from the edge, so hopefully they can fool the offense and get the quarterback before he can throw the ball. So there's the basic offensive and defensive spread sets. Now we're going to look at another set that is more common in the NFL today. In football back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, it was common to have an X, a Y, and a Z receiver, so a tight end, a split end, and the other wide receiver, a running back, and a fullback. That is less common today. So what teams do is they use a second tight end, sometimes called an H-back, sometimes called a move tight end. This is a tight end that isn't necessarily as good of a blocker as the Y tight end, but is usually a better receiver. And this is where they can put a defense in a bind. If the offense has a good H-back or move tight end that is a good receiver, how does the defense counter that? A lot of defenses will counter with three linebackers. And in this diagram, you can see that the defensive line is the same, the defensive backs are the same, but now we have an S, an M, and a W for linebackers for a strong, middle, and weak linebacker. These are often referred to as a Sam linebacker, a Mike linebacker, and a Will linebacker. Oftentimes, if you're watching a game, you will hear a quarterback or another member of the offense, oftentimes a center, will point out which one is the Mike linebacker. You'll hear them say 53 is the Mike, or 52 is the Mike, or whatever that player's number is. They're indicating which one is the middle linebacker because that will help determine how the offensive line is going to block either a run play or a pass play, which offensive players are responsible for the blitzing linebackers should they blitz. The Sam, Mike, and Will linebackers, these are typical linebackers, depending again on the defensive scheme. Oftentimes, anywhere linebackers these days can be 6'1", 220 pounds to 6'5", 250. It just depends on what the defense is trying to do. Against a two tight end set, so for example, with the Y and the H tight end, the linebackers might be a little bit bigger to handle those bigger receivers or handle those bigger tight ends. This is where the offense can put the defense in a bind, because if that move tight end or that H-back can line up wider in a slot position and they have a smaller linebacker on them or a linebacker that's not as good in pass coverage, that's an advantage for the offense. If the defense stays with that nickel formation, well, now you have a big 6'4", 250-pound tight end going up against a 5'9", 180-pound cornerback. So an offense is more likely to run because they have that blocking advantage. So these are just a couple of offensive formations, a couple of defensive formations to talk about. So as you're watching a game, you can get a better understanding of who's doing what, why certain players are lined up on the line of scrimmage, and why some players are moving around and others can't. We'll get into that a little bit more in another video. This has been Football to Base Podcast. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you on our next episode.